Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking chapters of Tieu Lac and the CEO's journey. As the CEO drifts between consciousness and unconsciousness, he keeps calling the names of Tieu Lac and their little daughter, but beside him are only cold machines and empty silence. Meanwhile, his mother secretly offers Tieu Lac a fortune, demanding that she stay in the village, raise their daughter alone, and disappear from the CEO's life forever. Will Tieu Lac accept this painful sacrifice for the man she loves, or will fate find a way to bring this family back together? Stay with us until the very end to uncover this emotional twist. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas filled with love, sacrifice, and unforgettable moments, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next episode. The intensive care unit was silent. Only the steady rhythm of medical machines echoed through the room. Beep, beep, beep. The CEO slowly opened his eyes for a brief second. The bright hospital lights blurred everything around him. His vision was unclear. His head felt unbearably heavy. He tried to move his hand. Nothing. His entire body seemed to belong to someone else. A nurse immediately noticed the movement. "Doctor, he's awake again." Several doctors rushed into the room. The CEO's eyes opened slightly. His lips trembled. One doctor leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer. Instead, his lips moved ever so slightly. "Tieu." The doctor exchanged glances with the nurse. "What did he say?" Again, barely louder than a whisper, "Tieu Lac." Outside the room, his mother stood frozen. She had heard every word through the partially open door. After everything, after every sacrifice, after every attempt to separate them. The first name her son called was still Tieu Lac. The doctors continued examining him. His consciousness is unstable. He may drift in and out for several days. Don't force him to remember too much. The CEO closed his eyes again. His breathing became steady. A few minutes later, he woke once more. This time he looked around the room. The ceiling, the machines, the IV lines, no familiar face. His dry lips moved again. "My daughter, where?" The nurse gently answered, "Please don't speak. You need to rest." He slowly shook his head. With all the strength he could gather, he whispered again, "Tieu Lac." No one answered, only silence remained. A single tear slowly slipped from the corner of his eye. Outside, his mother quietly turned away. She walked toward the hospital corridor alone. Every step felt heavier than the last. For years, she believed she knew exactly what her son needed: power, status, success. Everything she had done, she believed she had done for him. Yet now, lying between life and death, he wasn't calling for the company. He wasn't asking about the board of directors. He wasn't asking for wealth. He wanted only two people: Tieu Lac and their daughter. For the first time, she questioned herself. Had she truly been protecting him? Or had she been destroying the only happiness he had ever found? Hundreds of kilometers away, back in the village, life had almost stopped. The strawberry fields still needed care. The warehouse still had deliveries to organize. The city store continued operating, but the laughter that once filled the village had disappeared. Everyone worked quietly. No one smiled. Farmer Min looked across the fields. "It feels empty." The village chief nodded. He was the one who gave everyone hope. "We're only protecting what he left behind." Inside the small house, Tieu Lac sat near the window. Her daughter played quietly on the floor with wooden toys. Every few minutes, the little girl looked toward the door. "Mama, when is Papa coming home?" Tieu Lac forced herself to smile. "Soon." The child happily nodded. Papa promised. Those innocent words pierced Tieu Lac's heart. She turned away so her daughter wouldn't see the tears filling her eyes. That afternoon, a luxury black sedan slowly entered the village. It stopped directly in front of Tieu Lac's house. The villagers immediately recognized the expensive vehicle. No one welcomed it. The rear door opened. The CEO's mother stepped out alone. She wasn't accompanied by bodyguards this time. She quietly walked toward the house. Tieu Lac looked surprised. "You came?" The older woman nodded once. "I need to speak with you." Inside the modest living room, everything remained simple. Old wooden furniture, family photographs, children's drawings taped to the wall. The CEO's mother silently looked around. This tiny house contained something her luxurious mansion had lacked for years: warmth. Without saying anything, she slowly placed a large envelope onto the wooden table. Tieu Lac looked down. "What is this?" "Money." She didn't touch it. "I don't understand." The older woman looked directly into her eyes. "Take your daughter, stay here, raise her well, and never return to the city." Silence filled the room. Tieu Lac slowly stared at the envelope. She already knew what those words truly meant. The CEO's mother continued quietly. "My son survived, but he still needs months of treatment. When he recovers, he has responsibilities waiting: the company, the shareholders, the family." She paused briefly. "He cannot return to this life." Tieu Lac's voice trembled. This is because of me." The older woman answered honestly. "No, this is because of me." Tieu Lac looked surprised. The older woman lowered her eyes. "I made many mistakes. I won't deny that. But I will not allow him to lose everything again." She gently pushed the envelope closer. "There is enough money inside. Your daughter will never worry about food. She can receive a good education. You can live comfortably." Tieu Lac slowly shook her head. "I never stayed with him because of money." "I know." The answer came immediately. "That's exactly why I came myself." Neither woman spoke for several moments. Outside, the sound of children playing echoed faintly through the village. Life continued, but inside the small house, everything felt frozen. Finally, Tieu Lac quietly asked, "Does he know?" The older woman slowly answered, "No, he doesn't, and he never will." Those words broke whatever strength Tieu Lac still had. She looked toward her daughter. The little girl happily ran into her mother's arms. "Mama, look, I drew Papa." She held up a childish drawing, a family of 3 standing beneath a bright sun. Tieu Lac hugged her tightly. Unable to stop crying, the child gently wiped away her mother's tears. "Mama, don't cry. Papa will come home." Tieu Lac closed her eyes. If only promises alone could change fate. The CEO's mother quietly stood. She walked toward the doorway. Before leaving, she stopped. Without turning around, she spoke one final sentence. "If you truly love him, please, disappear from his life." The front door slowly closed, leaving only silence behind. Tieu Lac looked at the envelope still resting on the table. Then, she looked at the drawing in her daughter's tiny hands. Finally, she held her daughter tightly against her chest and broke down into uncontrollable tears. Outside the window, the afternoon sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Inside that tiny home, for the first time since meeting the CEO, Tieu Lac truly felt what it meant to face the future without him. The house remained silent long after the CEO's mother had left. The envelope was still lying on the wooden table. No one touched it. No one even looked at it. Tieu Lac sat on the edge of the bed, holding her daughter tightly in her arms. The little girl had fallen asleep after crying herself tired. One tiny hand still clutched the drawing she had made for her father. The picture was simple: a smiling father, a smiling mother, a little girl standing between them, 3 hearts floating above their heads. Tieu Lac gently traced the drawing with her fingers before tears blurred her vision again. "So this," she whispered to herself, "is all that's left." Outside the house, several villagers had quietly gathered. No one needed to ask why the luxury car had come. Everyone already guessed. Farmer Min sighed deeply. The chairman came herself. The village chief nodded. "That means she's made up her mind." An elderly woman looked toward the house. Poor Tieu Lac. She suffered enough. No one disagreed. Everyone knew how much the CEO loved Tieu Lac. They had seen it with their own eyes. But they also knew the enormous gap between 2 worlds. One belonged to towering skyscrapers, billion-dollar companies, and endless power. The other belonged to mountain roads, strawberry fields, and ordinary people trying to survive. Some distances could never be measured by kilometers. Inside the city hospital, the CEO slowly opened his eyes again. Everything around him remained unfamiliar. The white ceiling, the faint smell of medicine, the quiet hum of machines. He blinked several times before turning his head slightly. The room was empty. He swallowed painfully. "Tieu." His voice was barely audible. A nurse immediately approached. "Please don't try to speak." He ignored her. "My daughter." The nurse forced a gentle smile. "They're not here." His eyes slowly filled with confusion. Why? She couldn't answer, because she didn't know, or perhaps she wasn't allowed to know. Later that afternoon, the doctor met privately with the CEO's mother. "His condition is improving." "That's wonderful." The doctor hesitated before continuing, but emotionally, he becomes anxious every time he regains consciousness. He repeatedly asks for Miss Tieu Lac and his daughter. If possible, we recommend allowing familiar family members to visit. Silence filled the office. The CEO's mother looked down at the medical report. After a long pause, she quietly replied, "Not yet." The doctor frowned slightly. "Emotional support is important." "I understand," she answered calmly. "But not yet." That evening, she walked alone through the hospital garden. The autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the pathway. She stopped beneath a large tree and slowly closed her eyes. For years, she had believed strength meant never looking back, never doubting, never apologizing. Yet now, every step she took seemed heavier. She remembered the day she first met Tieu Lac. She had judged her instantly, a poor village girl, someone she believed could never belong beside her son. But then, she remembered something else, the photographs she had secretly seen. Her son laughing in muddy fields, holding his daughter on his shoulders, helping elderly farmers harvest strawberries, smiling without pretense, a smile she had almost forgotten he possessed. Quietly, she whispered, "When did I become the person my son feared the most?" No one answered, only the wind. Back in the village, night had fallen. Tieu Lac carefully placed her sleeping daughter into bed before returning to the small table. The envelope remained exactly where it had been left. She slowly opened it. Inside was a bank check large enough to change several lifetimes, along with a handwritten note. There were only 2 short sentences. "Raise your daughter well. Forget my son." Tieu Lac stared at the words for a very long time. Then she folded the note carefully, not because she accepted it, but because she couldn't bear looking at it any longer. She opened an old wooden box hidden beneath the bed. Inside were the memories of the happiest days of her life. A faded photograph of the CEO carrying baskets of strawberries through the fields. Their daughter's first pair of tiny shoes. a dried wildflower he had picked for her during their first harvest together, a handwritten promise: "I'll build a future where our daughter never has to cry." The paper had become worn from being opened so many times. Tieu Lac gently pressed it against her heart. "You kept every promise," she whispered through tears, "except you couldn't come home." The following morning, the villagers noticed something different. Tieu Lac had returned to work. She wore the same simple clothes, the same straw hat. She quietly sorted strawberries inside the warehouse as though nothing had happened. But everyone could see the truth. She smiled. Without joy, she spoke, only when necessary. The light in her eyes had disappeared. Farmer Min finally walked over. "You don't have to force yourself." She looked up with a tired smile. "If I stop working, I'll think about him. And if I keep thinking, I'll fall apart." No one knew how to respond. The entire warehouse fell silent. Meanwhile, in the hospital, the CEO's recovery continued slowly. He could now sit up for short periods. He could answer simple questions. But there was one thing that never changed. Every morning, he asked the same question: "Has Tieu Lac come?" Every afternoon, he looked toward the door. Every evening, he whispered to himself, I promised I'd go home." His mother stood outside the room, listening every single time. Each word became another weight on her heart. She had managed to keep Tieu Lac away, but she couldn't erase her from her son's heart. Several days later, a young nurse entered the room carrying fresh flowers. She smiled warmly. "These arrived this morning." The CEO looked surprised. "For me?" She nodded. There wasn't a name. He slowly accepted the bouquet. Hidden between the flowers was a tiny folded piece of paper. He quietly opened it after the nurse left. Only one sentence was written inside. "Your daughter still waits at the door every evening, believing her father will come home." His hands began to tremble. Tears slowly filled his eyes. "Tieu Lac," he whispered. At that exact moment, outside the hospital window, his mother saw the tears running down her son's face, and for the first time, she realized that separating two people who truly loved each other had not ended their pain. It had only multiplied it. But before she could make any decision, her phone suddenly rang. She answered. A nervous voice came from the other end. "Madam, the board of directors has called an emergency meeting. They've discovered the CEO is awake, and they're already making their next move." The color drained from her face because she knew the greatest battle was no longer between herself and Tieu Lac. It was about to begin inside the company itself. As the CEO struggles between consciousness and unconsciousness, he repeatedly whispers the names of Tieu Lac and their little daughter, only to find himself surrounded by cold machines and empty silence. Although his condition slowly improves, the people he longs to see are kept far away. Determined to separate them forever, the CEO's mother travels to the village and offers Tieu Lac a large sum of money, asking her to stay, raise their daughter alone, and disappear from her son's life. Heartbroken, Tieu Lac refuses to believe money can replace love, yet she breaks down as she realizes her daughter may have to grow up without her father. Meanwhile, the CEO continues asking for his family every day, unaware of the painful sacrifice being made in his name. Will love overcome this heartbreaking separation, or is this truly the end of their family?